It was supposed to be the best week of my life. A whole week in the mountains with my family. The excitement buzzed in my 7-year-old heart, my imagination already painting vivid pictures of adventure. We were going to a remote cabin that my parents had rented, tucked away in the dense, towering forests of the Appalachians. I had never been to the mountains before, and I was ready for anything except what awaited us. The drive was long but beautiful. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air turned cooler, fresher, and the world seemed to whisper ancient secrets. I pressed my face against the car window, eyes wide with wonder. When we finally arrived at the cabin, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was an old, creaky structure, standing lonely in a small clearing, the forest pressing in on all sides. The cabin seemed to watch us with its dark windows, like empty eyes. As we stepped out of the car, a strange woman appeared from the woods. Her sudden presence made my heart skip a beat. She was old, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes dark and piercing. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair was a tangled mess of gray. She stood silently at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an intensity that made me uneasy. My parents exchanged a glance, but my dad, always the friendly one, gave her a polite nod. "Hello there," he called out. "We're the Harringtons. We rented this cabin for the week." The woman nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving us. "I'm Mrs. Whitlock," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "I look after the place. You folks enjoy your stay, but be careful in these woods." Her warning hung in the air like a dark cloud. Before we could ask what she meant, she turned and vanished back into the trees. My mom shivered and put a hand on my shoulder. "Let's get inside and unpack," she said, trying to sound cheerful. The inside of the cabin was as old and creaky as the outside, but it was warm and cozy in a rustic sort of way. We settled in, unpacked our things, and soon the strangeness of Mrs. Whitlock was forgotten in the excitement of exploring our temporary home. That first night I fell asleep to the sounds of the forest, thinking only of the adventures that awaited us. The next morning, after breakfast, we decided to go for a hike. My dad had found a trail that promised beautiful views and a waterfall. I could hardly wait. We packed some snacks and water, and soon we were on our way. The trail was narrow and winding, the trees thick around us. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see Mrs. Whitlock standing behind us, but there was no one, just the trees and the rustling leaves. My parents chatted happily, pointing out interesting plants and birds, oblivious to my growing unease. We reached the waterfall around midday. It was beautiful, the water cascading down a rocky cliff into a clear pool below. We sat on the rocks, eating our snacks and enjoying the view. For a moment, all my fears melted away. But as we started back down the trail, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The sun was beginning to set when we heard a low, growling sound that made my blood run cold. My dad stopped, his face suddenly serious. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. My mom nodded, her eyes wide. "What was it?" Before anyone could answer, the growling grew louder, closer. Something moved in the shadows of the trees, something big. My dad took a step forward, trying to peer through the thick underbrush. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice firm. Then it lunged. The creature was a nightmare-made flesh, huge, covered in matted fur, with glowing red eyes and claws like daggers. It moved with terrifying speed, crashing through the underbrush with a roar. My dad barely had time to react before it was upon him, knocking him to the ground. "Run," he shouted, struggling to fend off the beast. But we were frozen, paralyzed by fear. The creature turned its eyes on us, and I knew we were doomed. It leapt at my mom, its claws slashing through the air. She screamed, a sound that would haunt me forever. And then nothing. The world went black. I woke up to the sound of rain. My head was throbbing, my body aching. I was lying on the forest floor, alone. Panic surged through me as I struggled to my feet. "Mom? Dad," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I stumbled through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. The rain was falling harder now, turning the ground to mud. I slipped and fell, scraping my hands and knees, but I didn't care. I had to find them. After what felt like hours, I came across a clearing. In the center was the creature, its back to me, hunched over something. My parents. They were lying on the ground, motionless. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The creature turned, its red eyes locking onto mine. It growled, a low, menacing sound that shook me to my core. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The creature took a step forward, then another. I turned and ran, the forest a blur around me. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I could hear the creature behind me, its heavy footsteps growing closer. I stumbled and fell, my ankle twisting painfully. I cried out, crawling through the mud, desperate to escape. And then, miraculously, I saw at the cabin. I dragged myself to my feet, limping towards the door. I threw it open and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. The creature crashed into the door, shaking the whole cabin. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears. For hours, the creature battered at the door, but it held. Eventually, the sound stopped. I sat huddled in a corner, too afraid to move, listening to the rain and the howling wind. The night seemed to stretch on forever, each minute an eternity of terror. When morning finally came, I was alone. The creature was gone, but so were my parents. I wandered through the cabin, calling their names, but there was no answer. I was alone in the mountains, miles from anyone who could help. I knew I had to leave. The thought of staying in that cabin, waiting for the creature to return, was unbearable. I gathered what supplies I could find: a flashlight, some food, a blanket, and set out into the forest. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I tried to follow the trail back to the road, but it was no use. The forest seemed to change around me, leading me in circles. Days passed, or maybe only hours. I lost all sense of time. I was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. I kept moving, driven by a primal instinct to survive. But the forest was relentless, and the creature was always just a step behind. One night, as I huddled under a tree, trying to stay warm, I heard a familiar voice, Mrs. Whitlock. She was standing just outside the circle of light cast by my flashlight, her eyes glowing in the darkness. "You can't escape," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "The forest won't let you." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was too tired. I just stared at her, my eyes wide with fear. "The creature is part of this place," she continued. "It won't stop until it has you." Why, I managed to whisper. "Why is it doing this?" She smiled, a cold, cruel smile. "Because it's hungry, and you are its prey." With that, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I was alone again, but her words stayed with me, a haunting reminder of my fate. The next day, I stumbled across a small stream. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. But the forest was endless, a maze of shadows and whispers. I was losing hope, my strength fading. And then, as I rounded a bend in the stream, I saw a small, run-down cabin. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter. I limped towards it, my heart heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, filled with the scent of decay. I found a small cot in one corner and collapsed onto it, too exhausted to care about the filth. I closed my eyes, hoping for a few moments of rest. But rest was a luxury I couldn't afford. The creature was still out there, and it was coming for me. I could feel it, a presence in the back of my mind, always watching, always waiting. I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing in.